Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe, and as always, I've got Sunny here with me. Hey, you know what's a real deep dive? Trying to find matching socks in my laundry basket. Seriously, it's like an archaeological dig every single time.
Oh, tell me about it. My deep dive this week, trying to figure out why my smart vacuum cleaner has this, personal vendetta against one specific chair, gets stuck every time.
Wow. See? The robot uprising starts small, under the furniture. But speaking of things that just keep going, it is time for our regular Trump tariff check-in.
That's right. We're diving back into the latest on the tariffs, the whole situation with China, and, whether China is actually finding any allies in all this.
Yeah, and we've got some other interesting bits, too. Later on, we'll hear what the Prime Minister of Singapore has to say about things, so definitely stick around for that.
Okay, so tariffs. It feels like the hope for de-escalation is,
fading.
Yeah.
The headlines aren't exactly screaming peace talks, are they?
No, not really.
Yeah.
And it's all happening alongside some pretty big stuff here in the U.S.
You mean the protests? Like 5 million people? That's a massive number. And tariffs are one of the things they were talking about, apparently.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a sense of public feeling, at least from a big chunk of people. And then there's the other side of it, concerns within the Republican Party itself.
Well, right, them. I read that a lot of them are, privately freaking out about these tariffs. Worried, but not saying much out loud.
Exactly. Politics, right. They're worried about the economic hit, but also the political fallout. There's even talk, maybe a bit quiet, that they're hoping the Supreme Court might somehow get involved.
The Supreme Court? Wow. That seems unlikely, doesn't it? A real long shot.
It absolutely does, but it kind of underlines how frustrated they are, that Congress doesn't have much say, that it's mostly driven by Trump.
And they're worried about inflation hitting before the midterms.
Right.
Or the tariffs not working out fast enough.
That's the tightrope, yeah. They need results, or they could face unhappy voters. And related to that, Trump's overall approval on economic policy. It's reportedly taken a hit.
Hit a low point, I saw. You put that together, tariffs, prices may be going up. This suggests people aren't thrilled.
It points to a potential link, definitely. A downward trend, since he took office. In terms of economic approval? Okay, so let's shift a bit. What about actual trade talks? U.S. and Japan met recently.
They did, with Trump involved personally. And you know how that goes. First reports, good progress.
Then the Japanese economy minister is like, hold on, not so fast.
Right. On NHK, he basically said, negotiations are gradual, no big concessions yet. And the sticking point seems to be currency exchange rates. Money.
Always the money. So what does the U.S. want from Japan?
Well, the list includes more U.S. auto imports, opening up their agricultural markets, and buying more U.S. stuff like LNG and military gear.
Okay. And if tariffs do hit Japan, what gets impacted?
It could be pretty significant for manufacturing. Think steel, transportation, even things like musical instruments and precision machinery.
Musical instruments, seriously. Tariffs on pianos. That'd be a weird one. It sounds strange, but yeah. And remember, Japan's had a trade deficit for 4 years, so a big jump in the yen's value, making their stuff more expensive for the U.S., probably not likely.
So they don't have a lot of wiggle room financially. Makes sense.
Exactly. Now, the whole point of these tariffs, supposedly, is bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., but U.S. manufacturing, it's generally been declining since 2000, right? Except for some high-tech areas.
Yeah, it's not like flipping a switch. Decades of global supply chains.
Yeah.
You can't just undo that overnight. And wouldn't tariffs just make things more expensive for U.S. businesses that need imported parts?
That's the risk, absolutely. The immediate effect could easily be higher costs for businesses, even if the long-term goal is different. Now, what about Taiwan? They seem kind of caught in the middle.
Totally. They're talking to the U.S., which is good, but no formal negotiations yet. And there's this buzz that they might be next on the list for tariff talks or some other economic deal.
Yeah, potentially targeting their finance minister for discussions even. And the impact could hit specific industries like shipbuilding and electronic components, particularly around Taiwan and Taichung.
So Taiwanese businesses are just waiting, watching.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
A wait-and-see approach makes sense with all the uncertainty. You mentioned something about the FOB model and electronics cushioning the blow initially.
Oh, yeah. Explain that. FOB.
Free on board. It basically means the seller's job is done once the goods are on the ship. So short-term, Taiwanese suppliers might not see profits dip right away. But long-term, if U.S. demand drops because prices go up, then yeah, it'll hurt.
Gotcha. And that weird potential upside. the U.S. needing more Taiwanese aftermarket car parts if new cars get too expensive.
It's a possible indirect effect, yeah. People holding on to older cars longer because of inflation. Okay, and South Korea, they're supposed to start formal talks this week, too.
Right, but it sounds like they have their own domestic headaches. Political turmoil, opposition parties might push back.
And pressure on their currency, the won, plus public unhappiness about inflation and housing costs. It's a lot to juggle heading into negotiations.
Definitely adds complexity. So overall, this Trump tariff policy, still pretty controversial, huh?
Oh, absolutely. You hear the arguments about disrupting supply chains, raising prices, but then others argue it has pressured some countries to make concessions. It's not black and white.
Yeah, it's still very much being debated. Okay, let's pivot. China trying to find friends to push back against the U.S. How's that going?
Well, first, there's the communication style clash. Trump apparently wants to talk directly to Xi or his inner circle. China prefers, lower-level officials hashing things out first.
Like one side wants a direct text, the other wants a formal email chain.
Something like that. Though there's some speculation based on reporter chats that maybe some high-level back-channeling has happened between Trump and Xi or someone close. You never know.
True. Okay, so Xi went on that trip, right? Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia. Did he manage to build an anti-U.S. tariff coalition? Doesn't sound like it.
No, the analysis suggests not really. Lots of agreements signed, sure, but the language on trade restrictions or the tariff war, very cautious, very vague.
So handshakes, but no real backup on the tariff front. What about specifics? Vietnam.
Even though they're supposedly brother countries, Vietnam's PM made a point of talking up strong U.S. ties right after Xi left. And they're actively chasing a trade deal with the U.S. Seems like they're leaning towards the U.S. or at least balancing carefully.
Interesting. And Malaysia.
Kind of like Indonesia, probably trying to balance between the U.S. and China, but likely leaning a certain way. And then there was that flag incident.
Oh, yeah. The newspaper printing the wrong Chinese flag.
Yeah.
Awkward.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just a mistake. Maybe.
Yeah.
Something else.
Who knows? Adds a bit of weird symbolism, though. Cambodia signed a statement with China, but again, didn't explicitly pick sides against the U.S. And that Japanese ship docking at the Chinese-funded port the same day Xi was there.
Right. Talk about sending a message. This port isn't just yours.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Indonesia.
They actually met with U.S. officials about potential U.S. tariffs on them. And the U.S. seemed pleased with Indonesia's reforms for fair trade. Plus, Indonesia's already put tariffs on some Chinese goods and restricted their e-commerce.
So they're definitely playing their own game, not just falling in line with China. And they invited Wang Yi for a 2+2 dialogue.
Yeah, that's foreign and defense ministers. A pretty high-level strategic talk. Could be Indonesia trying to leverage its position, perhaps. We can probably skip Russia offering bombers.
Bombers, yeah, let's move on from that. Nepal is actually investigating Chinese projects for corruption.
Oof. Yeah, that's a direct hit. Shows growing concerns about transparency. And even Thailand arresting a director from a Chinese railway firm. It could be a subtle signal.
So Southeast Asia, not exactly rallying to China's side. What about Europe? They can't be thrilled with U.S. tariffs either.
They have their issues with the U.S., for sure. But aligning with China against the U.S. seems unlikely. Why? Big concerns about technology theft and cheap Chinese goods being dumped on their markets. That clashes with European interests.
Right. You don't want your tech stolen or your businesses undercut. And what was that about TikTok sellers bypassing luxury brands?
Yeah, apparently Chinese sellers using platforms like TikTok to sell OEM stuff directly, cutting out the big European luxury brands. It kind of proves the U.S. warnings about unfair practices, and it's causing real anger, especially in places like France.
Ouch. That's got to hurt those brands. And some European leaders seem to be getting friendlier with the U.S. again. Italy's PM visiting Trump, Spain's economy minister in the U.S.
It hints at a potential warming, maybe moves towards U.S. trade agreements, which, would further isolate China on this.
Okay, and the U.S. plan? Slowly raising port taxes on China.
Yeah, a gradual increase over years. It's a slow wave pressure tactic. And maybe a model for future tariff talks, too, gives the other side an exit ramp, a way to de-escalate bit by bit.
A less dramatic approach. Okay, China's pushback. Retaliatory tariffs, but they excluded Hong Kong.
Right, and Hong Kong Post suspending deliveries to the U.S. seems limited. You can just ship via Macau, right?
Seems like it. More symbolic. And restricting rare earths. Is that full ban?
Probably not. More like a warning shot, the analysis suggests. And stopping Boeing purchases, that could actually backfire on China's own plane-making goals, since their C919 relies heavily on U.S. tech.
Huh. So their countermeasures might be hurting themselves too in some ways.
It's possible. The overall take is that their responses haven't really hit critical U.S. vulnerabilities effectively.
Okay, so let's wrap part one. De-escalation hopes. Dim. Trump's facing domestic pressure.
Yeah.
China's search for allies. Not yielding much. Everyone's kind of looking out for number one.
It really paints a picture of complex global trade dynamics, doesn't it? Domestic politics, international relations, all tangled up.
For sure.
Yeah.
And speaking of complex dynamics, we've got more coming up. We're going to dive into what the Prime Minister of Singapore thinks about all this, so don't go anywhere.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to get that perspective. But before we do, thinking about all these different countries and how they're reacting, what does that tell you about the real power dynamics right now? Is there one thing that stands out?
For me, I think it's how everyone is acting in their own self-interest. There isn't this big bloc forming against the U.S. tariffs, despite China's efforts. It just shows how complicated and, well, multi-sided the global economy is. Every country's making its own calculation.
That's a great point. We'll explore that more, especially with the Singapore perspective, right after this. Stay with us.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
We just finished untangling those latest twists in the tariff saga, and now we're shifting gears completely.
Yeah, definitely a change of scenery.
We're heading over to Southeast Asia to really dig into a fascinating recent speech from the Prime Minister of Singapore.
Exactly. Moving from those global economic currents, which, we just covered, to look at how a really crucial player in a very dynamic region is strategizing, how they see this evolving international landscape.
Okay, so our roadmap is the Prime Minister's address itself. It's titled Global Transformations, Singapore's Responses and Strategies. And we've also got a really insightful analysis piece that sort of zeroes in on what all this might mean for countries like Taiwan.
Right. Plus, there's always that backdrop of recent U.S.-China news, and of course, the Taiwan situation itself is always relevant context here.
So our mission really is to distill the core wisdom from Singapore's perspective on this changing world order. We want to understand the strategic playbook they're developing.
And crucially, I think, explore what lessons a fellow small democratic nation like Taiwan and maybe others in similar situations can glean from Singapore's approach.
Okay, let's unpack Singapore's take on this new world order. The Prime Minister, he starts with a nod to history, right?
Yeah.
Acknowledging the U.S. role during the Cold War.
Yeah, specifically mentioning containing communism in Indochina and arguing that this, it bought Southeast Asia some really vital breathing room to develop.
But what's interesting is the nuance right away.
Yeah.
Well, giving credit where it's due historically.
He subtly suggests the U.S. might not be able or perhaps willing to carry the full weight of solving every global challenge anymore. Single-handedly, anyway.
Yeah, that's a definite shift in tone, isn't it?
It is, and it connects to that point sometimes made. I think he referenced Marco Rubio saying it, that maybe the U.S.'s post-Cold War unipolar moment was like a historical aberration, not the permanent state of affairs.
That really sets the stage for this idea that the old certainties are dissolving. And then, of course, there's the big factor, China's continued rise,
which the PM frames through that lens of East is rising, West is falling, but also connects it to China's determination to, redress perceived historical grievances. It's a view rooted in a long historical perspective.
And interestingly, despite what maybe both sides might say officially, Singapore's read seems pretty clear. Both the U.S. and China are actively trying to pull other nations into their orbits. This idea of not having to choose sides, maybe wishful thinking.
Yeah, the analysis suggests geopolitical competition is back and it's intense. That's a key takeaway right there.
And that reality directly informs one of Singapore's core long-standing strategies.
Which is their serious, sustained investment in national defense, including conscription, which is a big deal.
That really jumped out at me too. The PM emphasizes this core belief. Ultimately, Singapore is responsible for its own security. They can't just rely on others.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it, about their strategic pragmatism, their realism.
For such a small country, geographically speaking, it's a powerful stance.
And to really get why they think this way now, you have to appreciate their incredible success story under the old U.S.-led rules-based order the last 60 years or so.
Absolutely. The speech touches on that whole post-World War II architecture. Decolonization, rebuilding former enemies, the Marshall Plan, the UN, IMF, World Bank, GTT turning into the WTO.
all of which basically created the conditions for smoother international trade, for open markets, for free trade to expand. And that was the environment where Singapore thrived, being so export-oriented.
But now the very conditions that allowed that order to flourish are, well, they're under strain.
Definitely. The PM points to things like declining domestic support within the U.S. for that kind of deep global engagement, feelings of being left behind by globalization, the costs of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the '08 financial crisis, COVID.
All leading to a bigger focus on domestic priorities in the U.S.
Which naturally means maybe less appetite for those huge overseas commitments we saw before.
And into this changing picture steps China, a nation that ironically benefited massively from that very U.S.-led system.
And has now emerged as a near-peer competitor. But the relationship is now marked by, frankly, deep mistrust and suspicion on both sides.
Which increases the risk of miscalculation, doesn't it? Especially around flashpoints like Taiwan. The potential for wider conflict is a real concern mentioned.
Yeah, it's palpable.
So what's the big picture view here? The PM seems to paint a world in a pretty messy transition. The U.S. might be pulling back from its traditional role as the global order keeper.
But there's no clear successor ready or willing to step into those shoes.
So the result is more competition, more mistrust.
Exactly, a more fragmented, maybe more disorderly world. And we're seeing the effects already, with countries rethinking their defense postures.
Like in Europe, right? Where uncertainty about U.S. commitments to Ukraine and NATO is forcing a major defense rethink.
And in Asia, too. Nations are looking at boosting their own missile and air defenses, and you even hear whispers about nuclear options being reconsidered, all stemming from questions about how reliable those U.S. security guarantees are long-term.
Wow. And it's not just security, is it? The economic system is feeling the turbulence, too.
Oh, absolutely. Geopolitical competition is starting to reframe economic interdependence. What used to be seen as a win-win is now often viewed as a potential vulnerability. A dependency risk.
Which is fueling this whole drive towards localization, bringing supply chains home, self-sufficiency.
And tighter state control over key industries and supply chains deemed strategic. We see economic tools, tariffs, export controls, sanctions being used much more overtly for national interests, not just pure economics.
And the U.S.-China trade war is the prime example, right?
Yeah.
Leading to near-stalled trade in some areas, lots of talk about decoupling.
And just generally straining the relationship even further. And as the Prime Minister really hammers home all these global shifts, they pose a profound challenge for small, open economies like Singapore.
Yeah, their entire model depends on stability, rules, the free flow of trade, capital, people, ideas. Disrupt that, and it hits them hard.
So Singapore's response isn't passive. They can't afford to be bystanders. The speech stresses they have to actively respond, shape their own destiny. And, importantly, they feel they're much better equipped to do that now than they were back in 1965 at independence. More resources, more connections.
Okay, so what are they actually doing? The speech laid out 3 core strategies.
Right. First is active participation in managing the global commons. Things like climate change, pandemics, upholding international law, strengthening multilateralism where possible.
He mentioned their role in the UN Ocean Biodiversity Treaty talks as an example of that engagement.
Exactly. The second strategy is all about the region. Deepening integration and unity within ASEAN. That's really central for them.
So pushing for things like 100% tariff reduction in ASEAN, cutting non-tariff barriers, building a digital economy framework together.
Upgrading FTAs with key partners like China, India, South Korea, even exploring an ASEAN power grid. And, crucially, championing ASEAN's own vision for an open, inclusive Indo-Pacific.
Okay, so global commons, regional focus. What's the third leg?
Broadening and deepening their global partnership networks. Not just relying on traditional allies, but building ties with a really diverse range of countries.
He listed quite a few. Australia, New Zealand, India, France, Germany, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Vietnam.
And mentioned actively exploring new collaborations in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, even opening new diplomatic missions there. It's about diversifying their connections.
So, strategy 1, engage globally. Strategy 2, integrate regionally. Strategy 3, diversify partnerships worldwide.
Pretty much. And underpinning all of that is this commitment to remain a safe harbor, a global marketplace, a trusted hub for exchange.
And the PM finished with a call for unity at home, right?
Yeah.
Stressing that Singaporeans need to stick together, hold shared values, stay open, stay collaborative to weather whatever storms are coming.
Yeah, that internal cohesion is seen as fundamental to navigating the external challenges.
Okay, this comprehensive strategy from Singapore, It definitely raises questions, especially when you think about other small allied nations in similar spots, and obviously the parallels with Taiwan jump out.
They really do, both small, democratic, facing significant, though different, geopolitical pressures. So what lessons could Taiwan or others draw from this?
Well, let's look at those three strategies again. First, active participation in global governance. Taiwan faces hurdles with formal organizations, obviously.
But they can definitely amplify influence through informal channels. Trade deals, cultural exchanges, tech cooperation. You mentioned semiconductors earlier. That's huge leverage.
Absolutely. And learning from Singapore's engagement in places like APEC, forums outside the strict UN system, seems like a smart play for Taiwan.
For sure. Then regional integration. Taiwan isn't in ASEAN, but that doesn't stop them building stronger regional networks. Economic ties, maybe even quiet security cooperation in Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Indo-Pacific.
That new southbound policy seems even more important now then. Diversifying away from just one market, building those regional partnerships.
Exactly, reducing dependency, building resilience. The third strategy, expanding global partnerships, is also key. Taiwan relies heavily on the U.S. for security, and that's vital.
But maybe diversifying is wise, forging closer economic, maybe security ties with Japan, the EU, Australia, exploring links even with neutral countries.
It gives them more diplomatic flexibility, right? Avoids putting all their strategic eggs in the U.S. basket, so to speak, reduces vulnerability to shifts in any single relationship.
And then there's the really critical one for Taiwan, strengthening autonomous defense, given the direct military pressure they face.
This is non-negotiable. Focusing on asymmetric capabilities, ways to counter a larger foe effectively, better reserve mobilization, self-sufficiency in key tech like semiconductors, again.
And maybe learning from Singapore's defense diplomacy, joint exercises, intelligence sharing with friendly nations.
That could definitely be part of the mix. Finally, there's that pragmatic approach to the changing world order. Like Singapore, Taiwan needs to navigate the U.S.-China competition flexibly.
Meaning, avoid getting locked into rigid ideological camps, while still upholding democratic values, of course.
Precisely. And maybe building goodwill with developing nations, economic aid, tech cooperation, ways to garner broader international support. It's about smart, pragmatic statecraft.
Now, there's another really fascinating layer to Singapore's story that informs all this. Their complicated history with communism. The analysis called it a love-hate entanglement.
That captures it pretty well. The hate part goes way back to their early days. The 1940s, 50s, 60s. They faced a serious internal threat from the Malayan Communist Party and its armed struggle.
And Lee Kuan Yew's PP saw communism as an existential threat to stability from the very beginning. You had those strong left-wing labor and student movements.
And the government response was, well, decisive. Operation Cold Store in 1963, arresting suspected communist sympathizers using things like the Internal Security Act.
It effectively crushed the communist movement internally, consolidated PAPI power, but also marginalized the left wing for a long time. And, there are still debates about the impact on political freedom.
Absolutely. It's a defining part of their anti-communist history. But then things shift towards pragmatism, especially with China from the 70s onward.
Initially, they were wary of China, right, as a source of communist expansion. They were pro-West, aligned with non-communist neighbors.
But China's economic reforms in 78 changed everything. Lee Kuan Yew visited China early in 76. They established formal diplomatic ties in 1990, relatively early for ASEAN.
And this is the love part, or maybe, like you said, pragmatic self-interest.
I think that's closer. Recognizing China's huge economic potential and actively participating. Think of the Suzhou Industrial Park, Tianjin Eco-City, big joint projects, prioritizing economic cooperation over ideology because for a small state that was crucial for survival and growth.
So a very calculated balancing act. Keep ideological distance, but engage economically where it makes sense.
And that balancing act continues post-Cold War. Internally, still vigilant against anything seen as destabilizing, emphasizing their own successful market economy.
But externally, pragmatic engagement with communist states like Vietnam and Laos within ASEAN, encouraging their market reforms.
While also maintaining those crucial security and economic ties with the West, the U.S., Japan for geopolitical balance.
So the challenge now is managing that relationship with a much more powerful China, while keeping their own identity and their Western ties strong.
Exactly, and dealing with those historical debates about the anti-communist actions back in the 60s. But overall,
it seems pragmatism, not ideology, is the main driver now. That love-hate thing is more historical memory than current policy driver.
I think that's fair to say. And that evolution itself, from intense anti-communism to pragmatic engagement, might hold lessons for others navigating tricky relationships, maybe even Taiwan with the PRC.
So just to quickly recap our deep dive today, we looked at Singapore's view of this shifting global order, their three-part strategy for survival and prosperity.
And importantly, the potential lessons there for Taiwan and other small nations trying to find their way in these turbulent times.
Plus, we explored that really complex history Singapore has with communism, which still shapes their pragmatic worldview.
Which leads us to a final thought for everyone listening. Considering Singapore's journey and the world we're in now, what are the fundamental principles that should guide small nations trying to protect their interests and their values in this more multipolar world? What does real resilience actually look like today?
Some really big critical questions to chew on there. And hey, before we forget, got to give a shout out to our buddy Micky.
I love that he's staying true to himself while exploring this new creative outlet. It's inspiring.
It really is. So to all our listeners out there, do yourselves a favor and check out Micky's YouTube channel. You won't be disappointed.
We'll drop a link in the show notes so you can easily find it. And hey, if you're feeling generous, give him a like and subscribe. Every bit of support helps.
Absolutely. Let's show Micky some love.
All right, folks, it's time to wrap up this episode of Sip and Talk. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. We love hearing from you. Peace out, everyone. Until next time.